Welcome back to Around the World Today. I'm Terry Davies, and in this episode, we are diving into one of the most powerful and most dangerous forces shaping modern politics, the rise of anti immigration narratives, and how they've been woven into the fabric of right wing political strategy. We live in a time when the world is looking very content, where the word patriotism has been redefined, repurposed, and in many ways weaponized, where political movements turn fear into voices, where migrants are blamed for problems they didn't create, and where national pride is increasingly measured by how loudly one can shout, not by how compassionately one can act. Today, we explore how these narratives grew from the fringe ideas to mainstream political thinking. Points we look at how the media amplifies them, how they distort the truth, and how they harm real people, individuals, families, and entire communities. But more importantly, we'll ask a question that often gets lost in the noise. What does genuine patriotism actually look like? Because loving your country shouldn't mean uh, fearing the people who come into it. It shouldn't mean turning neighbours into enemies. And it shouldn't mean abandoning the values that make society humane, fair, and decent. So join me as we unveil and unveil the fabric and the rhetoric, challenge the myths, and explore a more honest and compassionate understanding of what it means to belong and what it means to care about the place we call home. This is Around the World Today. Let's begin.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode. We really appreciate you joining us. This podcast really shows us how we can all learn, live, and thrive off of each other. By sharing our knowledge through our conversations, we will impart some knowledge whilst learning ourselves how to progress even further. Here is your host.
Alright, let's kick things off. To understand how this anti-immigration rhetoric becomes such a dominant force in politics, we need to start with a simple truth. None of this has happened by accident. The language we hear today, words like invasion, swarm, take back control, protect our borders, stop the boats, didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were crafted, redefined, tested, deployed with purpose. Politicians realised something very powerful. When people are anxious, they look for someone or something to blame. And if you can point that blame at a group with little power, little voice, little protection, you can shape public opinion with frightening ease. This is where the story begins. Over the past decade, anti-immigration messaging has shifted from the margins to the mainstream. What was once whispered on the fringes of far-right groups is now repeated in Parliament, plastered across newspaper headlines, and shunted out by online influencers who build their following on outrage and fear. But here's the problem. The narrative is louder than the truth. the truth is far quieter, blurred under layers of sensationalism and misinformation and political theatre. And so our job today is to pick apart the noise step by step and expose what lies beneath it. Because if we want to understand how patriotism becomes political, if we want to understand how nationalisms become normalised, then we have to start by understanding how immigration, real people, real stories, real lives, become a political weapon. So let's go into it. Let's pull back the curtain and let's begin with how these narratives were built and how they become so powerful. To understand the power of the political messaging around immigration, we need to examine how these narratives are built and why they work so effectively. Let's be honest, in modern politics, immigration has become less about policy and more about emotion. And emotion is a powerful currency. Right-wing political strategies learned from long ago that if you want to mobilise votes quickly, you don't start with facts and statistics or economic arguments. You start with feelings, fear, uncertainty, insecurity, a sense that something is being lost or taken away. These emotions create fertile ground for simple, dramatic narratives. And that's exactly what anti-immigration messaging is designed to do, isn't it? Do you remember Brexit? Nigel Farage and a billboard. Listen carefully to the language used in these narratives. And we will see. We are being overwhelmed. We are losing our culture. Our borders are under attack. We need to take back control. These aren't policy statements. They are psychological triggers. They tell people that danger is near, that someone else is responsible, that outsides are changing the world, and only strong leadership can protect them. But the truth, here is the truth. These narratives really do match the reality. Immigration levels, economic contributions, the legal distinctions between asylum seekers and migrants. None of this completely fits the free word slogan. So instead of complex troops, the narrative machine drives and delivers something much easier to digest. A story with heroes, villains, and a crisis that only one side can solve. In this story, migrants become the threat. The nation becomes the the victim. And the politician becomes the protector. It's political theatre, and it works. Not because it's accurate, but because it appeals directly to our emotions and bypasses our critical thinking. And underneath all of this cites a critical point. If people are encouraged to blame migrants for the challenges in their lives, housing shortages, the NHS pressures, low wages, they are less likely to question the decisions of the government itself. This is an autocracy how it works, a mishmash, a carefully engineered system of language, media messaging, and emotional manipulation designed to turn immigration into a symbol of fear than a matter of human reality. And once the machine is running, it's incredibly difficult to stop because it doesn't just shape opinions, it shapes identity, it shapes belonging, and eventually it shapes the political landscape itself. If the narrative machine is the engine, then when it comes next is the journey. How ideas that once lived on the extreme edges of politics gradually moved into the heart of the mainstream debate. This doesn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen by accident. For decades, far-right groups have pushed anti-immigration rhetoric that the most political parties wouldn't even touch. The language was too toxic, the claims too inflammatory, the tone too hostile. But something began to shift in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. Economic uncertainty, global instability, rising inequality, communities feeling ignored and left behind. These pressures created a political environment where simple answers and even forced ones became attractive. And that when mainstream parties made a decision, instead of challenging the fringe ideas, they began to adopt them. Not always the extremes, at least not at first, but the tone, the farming, and the suggesting that the UK has somehow, or is somehow, under threat from people arriving here. The messages moved from whispers and sidelines to slogans and campaigns on buses. And suddenly, what was once labelled far-right rhetoric became legitimate concern. Language once confined to extreme leaflets appeared in Parliament, in televised debates, and on the front papers of newspapers. And why? Because it worked. Because fear wins elections. Because making migrants the focus of public anxiety was easier than tackling the real structural causes of the people's frustrations. Over time, something even more troubling has happened. The far right no longer need to scream from the fringes. Their ideas had already been absorbed by the mainstream. Think about it. Terms like illegal immigration become everyday political vocabulary, even when referring to people exercising their legal right to claim asylum. The idea that migrants are a burden become widely accepted, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The notion that Britain was losing its identity gained traction, even though the identity has always evolved through centuries of migration, culture, and change. By adopting fringe rhetoric, politics didn't just open the door, they removed the hinges. And once these ideas enter the mainstream, they gain something of incredibly valuable legitimacy. Not because they were true, not because they were fair, but because they were repeated again and again by those in positions of authority. And when the public figures repeat something often enough, people begin to believe it. It stops sounding extreme. It becomes normal, expected, part of everyday political conversation. This is how fringe ideas evolve from the margins to the mainstream to the political centre to national policy. And at that point, challenging them becomes harder because they no longer look like fringe ideas at all. They look like common sense, even when they are anything but. If you're ready, I can write. But even when they are ready, again, they can be they are anything but common sense. If political rhetoric builds the narrative, and if the fringe ideas creeping into the mainstream give it legitimacy, then there is one force that turns it from political thinking point into a national obsession. The media megaphone. The media doesn't just report the news, it decides what is the news. And when it comes to immigration, that editorial power has shaped public perception more than any manifesto or party leaflet ever could. For years, certain newspapers and broadcasters have devoted extraordinary amounts of space to stories about boats, borders, and migrants, not balanced analysis and not neutral reporting, but sensationalism, headlines designed to shock, front pages designed to promote, stories designed to create a sense of crisis, and even when there isn't one. Think of the pattern. A boat arrives, clue, dramatic language, cue photos, deliberately chosen to maximise fear, cue commentators describing the event as if the country is under siege. Meanwhile, deeper stories like the reasons people flee their homes, the UK's legal obligations or economic contribution of migrants rarely make the front page. Why? Because fear sells, because outrage delivers clicks, because complex truth can't compete with a catchy headline. That is a bit of inflammatory headline too. But traditional media isn't the only player in this game anymore. Enter social media, a vast, unregulated landscape where misinformation spreads at lightning speed and where outrage is renewed by algorithms. Platforms like Facebook, TikTok and X have become amplifiers for some of the most extreme anti-immigration narratives imaginable. Unverified videos, emotive sound bites, edited clips that distort reality, influencers with no accountability but erroneous reach. And let's be clear, when sensationalized media meets unchecked social platforms, it creates a feedback loop powerful enough to reshape national attitudes. A newspaper prints a dramatic headline, social media shares it, influencers react to it. Politicians comment on it, news channels report on the comments, and the cycle repeats. Each time, more heat, less light. Before long, a single small event, a boat with 20 people, is treated as a national emergency, and the public, exposed to this cycle day after day, begins to believe the narrative. This must mean things are out of control. This must mean immigration is the biggest issue. This must mean someone is to blame. This is not an accident. It's well-oiled ecosystem in which fear travels faster than facts. The media megaphone doesn't just inform. It scrapples and scripts the debate. It chooses the villains. It fuels moral panic. And it turns political rhetoric into public statement. But here's the critical point. The louder the media megaphone becomes, the harder it is for the truth to become heard, which means the next segment is even more important. Because we now must ask, what's the reality? What's the truth behind all of this noise? And why does it matter that the media are so often getting it wrong? After all the headlines, political speeches, and manufactured panic, we arrive at the most important part of the discussion. The reality. Because behind every slogan, behind every fear-driven narrative, behind every politician pointing at a boat on the television, there is a truth. That reality, and in reality, really makes it into public conversation. And that truth looks very different from the rhetoric. Let's start with the basics. Migration is not out of control. Despite what the headlines suggest, the UK is not being overrun. Asylum seekers make up a tiny fraction of the population. The majority of migration comes from legal routes, students, healthcare workers, people filling essential jobs. The idea of an invasion is a political friction that and not that of a statistical reality. 2, migrants contribute far more economically than they take. Study after study shows that migrants contribute billions to the UK economy through taxes, spending, and vital labour. Without migration, key industries would collapse. The NHS would lose thousands of doctors and nurses. Agriculture would struggle to harvest its crops. Care homes would lose essential staff. Universities would lose funding from international students. Yet somehow the narrative always focuses on migrants supposedly take not what they give. 3, asylum seekers are not illegal. This point is crucial. Under international law, anyone, and that's anyone, has the right to seek asylum. The phrase illegal asylum seeker is nonsense. It exists only to dehumanize. People fleeing war, persecution, or danger have the right to ask for safety, and the most who arrive do so because they have no other option. The boats are a symptom, not a cause. The reason people risk the channel is not because Britain is an easy target, it's because there are almost no safe routes left. If safe routes were restored, the boats would stop. This is not complicated, but a solution. It doesn't feature well in political campaigns because it doesn't create fear. Migration doesn't cause social problems, but it gets blamed for housing shortages caused by decades of underbuilding, NHS waiting times caused by chronic underfunding and lack of staff retention, low wages caused by a weak labour practitioners and corporate decisions. Blaming migrants for these issues is not just wrong, it's a deliberate distraction. Some six. The real story is human. And this is perhaps the most important reality of all. When we strip away the rhetoric, what's left are people, families who fled violence, young people escaping oppression, workers hoping for opportunity. Human beings, not headlines, not statistics, not political tools. Most migrants want what everyone wants: safety, dignity, and a chance to build a life. But political rhetoric and the media narratives often strip them of their humanity. They've become numbers, they've become threats, they've become problems to solve. The reality is migrants are part of the community. Our economy, our public services, our culture, our shared patriotism, and our shared future. And the more we understand this, the more clearly we can see how harmful the rhetoric truly is. Because if the narrative is built on fear, the reality is built on humanity. And it's time that humanity shaped our politics, not the other way round. Now that we've explored the narrative machine, the mainstream of the fringe ideas, the media amplification, and the human reality behind migration, it's time to look at the bigger picture. Why does all of this matter? Because these anti-immigration narratives are not just misleading, they actively harm society. Let's break it down. 1, they divide communities. Fear-based messaging teaches people to look at their neighbour as threats. It creates suspicion between communities that would otherwise coexist peacefully. It fosters resentment and, in some cases, even violence. Instead of focusing on common goals, people are encouraged to focus on differences. And that weakens our social fabric. 2, the erode of trust in democracy. When emotion overtakes evidence, people start believing what feels right rather than what's true. Politicians exploit this by blaming outsiders for problems caused by politicians and policies, funding cuts, or governance failures. The result: citizens become misinformed, cynical, and more likely to support divisive measures, even at the expense of fairness and justice. 3. They distract from the real issues. Housing shortages, health pressures, job insecurities. These are complex structural problems. Blaming migrants for these issues is convenient for politicians, but it solves nothing, does it? It's a distraction, allowing those in power to avoid accountability while the public fight a manufactured problem for they concede compassion. A society without compassion. Could you imagine it? A society that treats fellow human beings as threats loses part of its moral compass. When fear dominates the conversation, empathy shrinkens. And without empathy, communities become hostile, exclusivity, and less resilient. 5. They undermine patriotism, true patriotism. Finally, these narratives redefine patriotism in the wrong way. It's no longer about care for one's country or one's fellow citizens. Instead, it becomes a weapon of division, a way to measure loyalty by fear rather than action. True patriotism doesn't come from heated or suspicion or hatred. It comes from engagement, fairness, and commitment to improving society for everyone, citizens, newcomers alike. When we step back, the pattern is clear. Anti-immigration narratives create fear, division, and destruction. They erode trust, they weaken communities, and they make politics about conflict, not solutions. Society suffers, not because migrants arrive, but because we allow fear to shape our response. And that is why understanding these narratives, exposing them, and telling the truth is not just important, it is essential. So we've examined the narrative machine, seen how the fringe ideas become the mainstream, explored the media megaphone, and faced the human reality behind migration. We've also looked at how fear-based rhetoric harms society, how it's time to ask these simple but essential questions. What does real patriotism actually look like? Because the version sold to us by fearmongers is not patriotism at all. It's a narrative of masquerading as love for our country. It's exclusion dressed up as loyalty. It's suspicion and division packaged as pride. True patriotism, on the other hand, is something very different. 1. Inclusion, not exclusion. A patriotic society doesn't measure loyalty by who belongs and who doesn't. It recognises that newcomers are a part of its national fabric, contributing, enhancing and strengthening the community. It says we are better together. 2. Compassion, not fear. Real patriotism shows care for the vulnerable. It doesn't turn fear into policy. It builds bridges, protects the weak, and stands up for human dignity. free. Responsibility, not blame. Being patriotic means holding leaders accountable for policy decisions, for the treatment of citizens and migrants, and for the well-being of the country as a whole. It means addressing real problems, not scapegoating those with the least power. 5. Courage, not complacency. True love of country often means challenging the status quo. It speaks out of fear, dominates the conversation. It's rejecting diverse rhetoric even when it's popular. It's remembering that what makes a nation strong isn't borders or slogans, but values, fairness, and humanity. In short, patriotism is about who you can not exclude. It's about who you can protect, empower, and welcome. It's about lifting everyone up, not keeping someone down. It's about building a society we all can be proud of, not just a select few. If we want to create a country that is truly strong, truly fair, and truly united, we need to reject fear and embrace this higher standard of patriotism. Because love of our country isn't about shouting louder. It's about acting better. It's about seeing humanity in everyone. And that's ultimately is the challenge we face today. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. We've taken a deep dive into how anti-immigration narratives have been built, amplified and normalised in modern politics. We've explored the role of the media megaphone, and we've confronted the human reality behind the rhetoric. Most importantly, we've examined the harm these narratives cause to communities, to democracy, and to the very idea of what it means to love your country. But we've also looked forward. We've asked the difficult questions about patriotism and nationalism, and we've explored what it means to care for a country in a way that is far compassionate and inclusive. This message is clear. Real patriotism is not about fear, exclusion, or blaming others. It's about humanity, responsibility, and building a society we can be proud of. If there's one takeaway I hope you can carry with you from this episode, it's this story we choose to believe, and the narratives we allow to determine, shape this kind of society we live in. And we all are a part and have a part to play in ensuring that these stories reflect the truth, compassion, and shared humanity. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope it has challenged your thinking, encouraged reflection, and inspired a rewarded sense and a renewed sense of what it truly means to care for your country and for one another. Join me over the next 4 Sundays in Advent as we prepare for Christmas here on Around the World Today. I'm Terry Davies, and it's been Around the World Today, Series 8, Episode 3, Nationalism and the Ballot Box, How Patriotism Become Political. I will see you soon, and have a great day.
Add us to your podcatcher or on iTunes now so that you can make sure you never miss out on another second of our wonderful podcast. We would hate for you to miss out. Have a great week, everyone.